How's it going, everyone? Vlad here with solosplc.com, and today I wanted to address a seemingly important but basic question, which is how do I connect to my PLC or industrial controller when it comes to a home lab, when it comes to a small industrial machine, or when it comes to the enterprise. Now, the idea is to walk you through some of the basics that you will find and the tools that you would use building up to the enterprise connection, because there are quite a few pitfalls, and I will be giving you some tips and tricks along the way based on my experience, and ultimately letting you know what is more risky perhaps or less risky, so that you could make the right decision for your company, your contractor, or maybe yourself when it comes to connecting to these devices. So behind me, you see a full wall of different PLCs, and all of them are going to pretty much have the same connections, but not always. So when it comes to the most fundamental or most basic connection, it's going to be plugging in directly into the PLC. And so there's going to be a couple of different options in that specific case. The first one being a USB or serial connection. We're going to discuss the different adapters in a second. And the other one is typically going to be via Ethernet. Now, why would you connect over one versus the other? So when it comes to a standalone machine, when you know the PLC is not connected, or if it's sitting perhaps on your test bench inside of a lab, you can very easily determine that that PLC is not going to be talking to any other devices. So there is an inherent risk if you go to a PLC that is on the plant floor. If you want to access that IP address, you're going to run into some challenges. Therefore, I typically say that the easiest and probably the most reliable and sort of the safest, and again, I use that a little bit in quotes because that's not always the case, but the connection is going to be over serial or USB. So depending on the version, so here you have the rack of Allen Bradley, you know that even the Ethernet card has a USB port that you can plug into, and you'll be able to access that card. Similarly, there's going to be PLC. So on this side, you see the Opto 22 controller. You should be able to plug in via USB and be able to communicate with that PLC using the right software. Now, where are the pitfalls of serial and USB? So not all of them are going to be able to go directly to your laptop or your computer, because some of the newer models are going to have the right port that's going to require a single cable. But in the instance of, for example, the Micrologix 1100 series PLC that you can see right here, you're going to have to use a converter from RS-485 or sometimes RS-232 to connect via USB. And typically you can buy those adapters relatively cheap to convert those protocols, but the problem becomes if you buy an adapter that doesn't have the right chipset, you might run into problems. You're going to have to install drivers, and so people sometimes get confused or get blocked with the idea of buying too cheap of an adapter, and then they cannot connect to the device and they simply give up or move on to something else. Now, why is this the safest way? Well, the reality is that if you connect over USB, typically, and again, I say that typically because in the Allen Bradley world, you could still drill down through the backplane and then access the plant network if that device is on any kind of network, but you are still constrained to connecting to that specific PLC. And so what you will typically find is if you have a machine that has a network connection to other devices, when you connect over USB, you're not going to be easily able to connect to those devices, even though they're plugged into the PLC, which means that you risk a lot less going to the wrong device via an IP address, which is going to be the second way we're going to look at in a moment. So the second way to connect, as I've alluded to a little bit earlier, is going to be over Ethernet. Now, what are some of the challenges with Ethernet? And I'm going to walk you through maybe from the most simple connection to the more complicated enterprise connection. And so on the most basic fundamental level, you should be able to take an RJ485 cable, an Ethernet cable, plug it into your laptop, and plug in the other end into your controller or Ethernet adapter card. So what are the challenges there? So the first challenge, if you have a standalone PLC that has not been initialized, it doesn't have any program on it, then there's going to be different tools that you need to use in order to set the IP address. So depending on the manufacturer, you need to be familiar with the process of setting an IP address from scratch. So if I simply plug into a PLC that has been never set, I may need to use other tools and ways to configure my Ethernet adapter on my laptop before I can actually establish that communication. And we have different videos. This is going to be different for your Allen Bradley controllers, your Siemens controllers, Opto 22. So they're all going to use different way or slightly different ways to get online for the first time. Now, if you have a machine that's already running, so you know that that controller probably has an IP address, or maybe it hasn't been set yet, but in most cases it has been set to something so that you could load the program. Well, there's going to be some nuances there as well. So some of the newer Allen Bradley controllers that you see again on the rack here are going to have a little window that's going to scroll the IP address through that Ethernet card, so when you plug in, you know exactly what IP address you're going to. Similarly, on the Opto 22 side, if you click on that screen and if you go into the settings, you can see what IP address you need to connect to. But in some instances, again, on the older controllers, on, for example, the Siemens S7 1200 series, there is no display of IP address. So you're going to have to use other ways to figure out what the IP address is before you're going to be able to go online. And typically you need to know the ways to figure out that IP address is depending on the different manufacturer. So it becomes a little bit more complicated to connect to that PLC or to reset that IP address so that you could set your own in order to establish communication. So what are the risks involved in connecting that way via Ethernet IP, Profinet, or via RJ485? Well, the first risk is obviously, if that device is in a plant setting, chances are it is on some sort of either private network, maybe machine network, or plant network. And so you need to be very careful when you plug into that PLC. You can have different, I want to say, connectivity issues that may be due to the devices on that network. So the first risk is obviously connecting to the wrong device. How do you minimize that risk? Well, if you absolutely must minimize it, or if you're uncertain of the IP addresses, you should be disconnecting any other ports on that same PLC or rack and connecting only your laptop. Now, this problem can also occur with devices or PLCs that have multiple ports. So depending on the brand of the PLC, you can have two ports that are on the same network, or you can have two ports that are going to be on different networks. So that PLC, for example, is connected to a private network that's going to be machine level, and then it's connected also to the plant network that's going to have an entirely different IP address. And that's a whole other almost networking concept. But ultimately, depending on how you plug into that PLC, you may be accessing it from one side or the other. And so this is where some of these nuances on the networking side can come in. A lot of times when you have a standalone machine or maybe industrial panel, when you open that door, you're going to find your PLC, but you're also going to have what's called a network switch. And you see a couple of examples here above my head that are going to be, again, executing some kind of a function on that network. And in a lot of cases, you're going to have unmanaged switches, which typically means that you can still plug into them and be able to establish the connection to the PLC side. However, again, you need to be careful what other devices are on that network, what kind of traffic is being sent. But ultimately, the most important thing you need to pay attention to is what IP address is assigned to your PLC so that you connect to that specific PLC and not something else on the network. So in generally, when you scan that network, you'll be exposed to a lot of different devices if they are in fact on the network. So the risk is connecting to a different device and not the one that you were hoping to connect to, and changing some of the settings on that side. Now, if you have managed switches, so again, this is your Stratix 5700 series all the way above my head. I believe that those are now end-of-life products, so you should be able to see the new models coming into the plants. But ultimately, those devices can also have their own configurations, which means that if you simply plug in a cord into that switch, you can very easily bring down the network, or you could just not be able to connect because the port has been closed off to any other IP or MAC addresses. Now, again, that's a whole other networking concept, but I just want you to be aware that the managed switches can have configurations that prevent just any device from being plugged in and then connecting to any other PLCs in this example, so it may increase the complexity in getting onto that connection. As we move higher up in scale, we're going to discuss the networks when it comes to connecting via plant network. So depending on where you stand at the facility, you might be able to plug in directly to the private network of that PLC, or you might have to go through what's called a router or a level 3 switch. Now, what that typically means is if you're on the private network, if you're able to plug in your laptop into the private network, regardless of the location of your PLC, you should be able to assign yourself an IP address, or in very rare occasions, you will have a DHCP that assigns the right IP address. And then using the right tools, depending on the manufacturer, you should be able to ping that IP address and then go online with the PLC. Now, when it comes to managed plant networks, you should be able to also go online in whichever area, be given a DHCP level address, and then you should be able to tunnel, or like I said, via a level 3 switch or router, go online with that PLC. So this is going to be a little bit more complex. It typically involves corporate IT to set this up. And so if you have that kind of an environment that you're working in, you should probably talk to an engineering or IT level manager who understands the network, can provide you with a way to connect. This is not something that you would typically build or set up, or I want to say execute on your own. So you need to be really careful which IP address or which network that is on the private plant side you connect to, and then how you make the hop to the PLC. And this could be involving either, like I said, getting an IP address through DHCP, or it could be setting an IP address from a given range for your specific laptop in order to be able to go through that gateway and communicate with that PLC. The next way of connecting is going to be remote access. Now, remote access doesn't necessarily mean that it's completely outside of the plant. One of the tricks that I really like to give younger engineers, and this is something that I've used for many years, is using a wireless router or switch. So here, if I move aside, you'll see a very small device that I can flip on its side. So this is going to be a TP-Link switch that is wireless, and that is how typically I connect to the PLCs on this wall. Now, why is that way of connecting particularly interesting? Well, what happens during startup activities, especially in large enterprise systems or even in machines, is that you don't have the plant network ready. The IT team hasn't, landed all the cables, and so you're not able to connect remotely or via the wireless network. And so what that little device allows you to do is to create a network, essentially just like you would access in your house wirelessly, but through your laptop, and still be able to route to the PLC. So in practice, what does that look like? So on the private network, you can have an IP address range of 192.168.1. Let's say 1 all the way to 255. And so you're going to assign an IP address for that router, and you're also going to assign an IP address to your laptop. Once you connect over wireless to that router, you'll be able to connect to the PLC that resides, as an example, on 192.168.1.100. And so what does that allow me to do? Well, ultimately, I've been in scenarios where I had to test I/O in the field, so I would have to physically carry the laptop around and be able to toggle certain inputs and watch certain outputs energize when the inputs were set. And so what that meant is that I had to climb ladders to go test the sensor, for example, all the way up on a filling tank. I needed to toggle that valve gate and see if I get the right response from the input side. And it makes it extremely impractical if I have to have the cable plugged in while I'm carrying that laptop around. So I can simply go on the wireless network and I can commission the machine. And as you've seen, the device is very small. I believe that the current price is around $50. So very, very important to carry in your tool bag. So let's briefly discuss the risk of connecting that way. And the risk in my mind is fairly limited or relatively small, because what happens is, first of all, you have a secured connection via password. You can also add double factor authentication, but ultimately those devices are not going to have a very long range, and they're not sending any traffic over a network. So essentially, if you're in proximity of the factory, and maybe if somebody drives up to the wall of the factory and knows the passwords and knows how to navigate the network, then they might be able to gain access via that wireless network. But it's going to be really difficult if you set the right password, if you set the right permissions. And like I said, you can very easily lock that down to, let's say, only your laptop or your MAC address. The next way of remote communication is going to be your VPNs. Now, there's going to be different types of VPNs on the market. I'm going to discuss the one first that you drop into a panel. So in many projects, what happens is that you have a PLC that has been commissioned by a certain group or a certain manufacturer of that machine. And what they will want to do is to have remote access so that they can troubleshoot remotely and be able to go online with the PLC in case there is any problems that arise. It could be a misuse of the machinery, but it could also be them making sure that everything is running correctly, and they collect some data, or they periodically check on the program of what is going on after they've installed it at the factory, or they could be making some changes as they learn other things from their machines. So what does that look like? Well, typically you have a panel that has its own switch, it has its own PLC. Maybe that panel has been networked to the plant, but the IT team on the factory side is either unable to create a VPN connection, or they simply don't allow it. So what the manufacturer, or one of the options that you have, is you can plug in one of these devices, and there's going to be a few manufacturers that you can look up, and I'm going to list them as well, that you can drop their device. You can then plug in that private network of the PLC via the switch that is inside of that panel, and then that device can connect either a wireless connection, which is going to be through the plant, let's say, guest network, but it can also have cellular connection, which allows it to be completely independent of the manufacturer. So what that creates is a VPN, or a virtual private network, that allows the whoever has access with the password, obviously the credentials, to then tunnel in to that PLC and be able to access obviously the PLC and whatever else is on that network. So it could be the HMI, remote IO, so on and so forth. Now, what are the dangers in this case, right? Because I think a lot of people advocate for this type of a connection, but it does have certain risks. So number one, that password and that connection can easily be shared. Now, I've never had an instance where a contractor would maliciously share that information with somebody else, but there's always that risk. And so when that person connects to that machine, they obviously have full access to what is inside when it comes to software. They can change it, they can modify it, they can load whatever they need. They can also push updates at a time that has not been pre-convened. Again, that has never happened to me, but they certainly have that capability. If they put maybe a person that is very unexperienced in PLC programming, they could also cause a crash of the machine if they change certain tags, values, or the program. So those are the risks that maybe you need to live with if you're going to be doing that a little bit short term. But ultimately, the person who has access to that device is going to have the power of when they connect. If you want to protect yourself as the facility, you can also unplug the device when you deem that it's not necessary for that external resource or whomever to have access. I've also seen ways that the plant can de-energize that device via a push button or a toggle switch, and then re-energizes when the contractor requests access, and then they would physically re-energize that device for, let's call it 48 hours via the HMI, using a very simple relay, give the contractor access for 48 hours, and then it will be turned off again, restricting access from anyone outside the facility. The next way of connecting to a PLC that I want to discuss is going to be using the plant resources. So this is going to apply to large enterprise, and this is something that I've not seen smaller sites implement until they've grown to a certain complexity where they do need this capability. So what I'm talking about is a local server that's going to run different tools. So this could be your TIA portal, this could be your Studio 5000, this could also mean some HMI tooling, then Cognex tools. So on that server, you're going to load that software, and then you're going to provide a VPN access to that server, to any external resource that will be using that, but also to your internal technicians and engineers whenever they need to access the PLCs or any other automation devices. So what does that look like? Well, first of all, in this case, IT always needs to be involved because they're going to be setting up that hardware as well as the networking side to the OT equipment. So this requires a lot of your devices on the control system side to be online, because if there is no connection to that server, there's absolutely no way for those applications to access the PLC. Now, when it comes from the technician and engineer side to connect to those devices, they would have to VPN into that network on the IT side, launch those applications on that server, and then those applications are going to connect to the PLC, HMI, or any other field device. What are the advantages of doing it this way? Well, The first one is that typically your technical resources are not going to need extremely powerful laptops. So a lot of us travel with at least 16 gig of RAM laptops. We have graphics cards inside of them. We want them to be an engineering workstation that are capable of running different virtual machines, different tools that may require more computing power. Well, if you have a server running those applications, then my laptop can essentially be a very basic terminal through which I VPN to that server, and then the server allows me to connect to that device and will execute all of the computing. Now, obviously, at that stage, you also always require a connection to that server. So you also need to make sure that you have access points. You need to make sure that you have really good cybersecurity best practices. And ultimately, you need to make sure the networking is right and that all of the devices that you need to access are going to be on that network. What usually happens is that you're going to have some stragglers, and what I mean by that is some PLCs on standalone machines that have not been connected to the facility, thus they don't have access to the server. Thus, the engineer and the technician who is supporting that application has no access to those PLCs, and so they have to bring in quote unquote rogue laptops to be able to connect to them via Ethernet cable, USB, you name it, that are not going to be sanctioned by IT. And so one of the pluses of going via this infrastructure is that you can then manage who has access to that server and ultimately who's able to connect to those devices. If you have a contractor that is capable, you can certainly evaluate that, and that's a whole other discussion. You can then give him access, whether it is temporary or permanent, and so they then also access the server. They can launch those applications and then they connect to those PLCs at the facility level. The last way I want to discuss about how to connect to PLCs is the emergence, I want to say, of these cloud applications. So you can run your Studio 5000, you can run TIA Portal inside of a cloud on AWS, GCP, or Azure, and then be able to tunnel through a VPN or other means of essentially directing network to your field devices or PLCs. And there's a couple of companies that are doing it this way, but ultimately even the manufacturers are starting to look into this. I believe that TIA Portal or Siemens have released the service already. I believe that Rockwell is looking into it. So I think that there's going to be an emerging way to pay for launching an IDE in the cloud, but ultimately that needs to network all the way back to your facility and to your field device PLCs in order for you to be able to connect. So if you have any questions about all these different methods of communicating or connecting to a PLC, or if you have maybe suggestions on some of the ways I have not mentioned, if you've seen something else in the field, always happy to chat. Make sure to leave that down in the comments. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.